The Lycée Carmel, where Thérèse found her vocation, had a missionary charism, and as a result, the community frequently sent young sisters out to start new Carmelite communities in other places. Thérèse herself had volunteered to join a mission to establish a new Carmel in Hanoi, Vietnam, but at that point her health was too fragile, and she was denied. This, plus the reforms instituted by St. Teresa of Avila, which capped the number of nuns in a given convent at 21, meant that the 15-year-old Thérèse was one of only a few young sisters in a community of largely older women. Convent life meant a lot of heavy physical work to be performed at exacting standards without the convenience of hot water or electric appliances. Day's consistent interest in presenting the life of Thérèse to her readers is to offer an image of the young Carmelite saint as a woman of the people, as a working woman. The woodcuts that Catholic worker artist Ari Bethune created for the newspaper at Day's request all show the saints in contemporary dress, engaged in manual labor and the works of mercy. Bethune's image of Saint Thérèse, who actually was a contemporary figure, is based on a series of photographs of Thérèse and her sisters working in the Lycée Carmel, and shows Thérèse scrubbing laundry in a washtub. One of the significant tasks in a community committed to caring for each member until the end of her life is the work of running the infirmary. In her late teens, Thérèse served as the assistant to the sister in charge of caring for the sick and elderly nuns. In November and December of 1891, the convent got hit with the influenza epidemic, where several of the sisters died. Everyone got sick, but Thérèse and two others had slightly more mild cases than the other sisters. These three alone had to keep the ordinary operations of the whole convent running and care for the sick. The usual frequent correspondence between Pauline, Marie, and Thérèse, who were inside Carmel, and Céline and Léonie, who were still out in the world, seems to have paused during the epidemic. Day writes, "No letters, no communications with her sisters are left to us from this time. There are 2 blank months, when from dawn to dusk, duties pressed upon those who were still up and about. How few their numbers now, how little cooking needed to be done, but how greatly increased was the washing as in all sickness. Probably many a good housewife came often to bring cooked food that would save work for the well sisters and tempt the appetites of the convalescent." Day herself had served as a nurse in New York City during the 1918 influenza pandemic. At the end of World War I, when many medical providers had been drafted or had volunteered to care for wounded soldiers in Europe, the poor who received care in charity clinics in the United States were suffering. "What am I doing for my fellow men? They are sick and there are not enough nurses to care for them," Day wrote in a letter to a friend. Day signed up as a probationer nurse at Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn. The work was physically demanding, if not particularly technical, and at 19 years old, the same age that Thérèse was when the influenza epidemic struck her convent, Day found the work both meaningful and exhausting. It was also an occasion for Day to put flesh on her ideals of human dignity and solidarity. In her autobiography, Day describes her encounter with an elderly patient, an old Canadian woman, 94 years old. Granny objected to being bathed, saying that she had bathed the day before, and at her time of life she did not see why she had to be pestered with soap and water the way she was. Granny fought the young nurses assigned to her care, who prevailed upon her that they loved her and that everything they were doing was for her own good. "Love be damned," the little old lady cried. "I want my wig." Through the wisdom of another nurse, Miss Adams, a Catholic and Day's partner on the ward, Day came to understand that caring for the sick by dispensing medicine, preparing meals, bathing patients, and washing linens was not the fullest meaning of this work of mercy. Miss Adams, she writes, had sympathy and understanding and realized that the little old lady needed much more than soap and water and clean bed linen. She needed more than to be loved. She wanted to be respected as a person, and for that she needed to have her wishes respected. She needed such appurtenances as her wig. After one of the most difficult days on the fracture ward, caring for a patient who deliberately threw a bedpan full of human waste onto Day's shoes and stockings, Day describes the conversation that she had with the head nurse, who spoke with Day about the dignity of nursing and the sacrament of duty that they were engaged in caring for the poor and the sick. "I have never forgotten it," Day wrote. A generation earlier, once the Lisieux Carmel community had recovered and come through the flu epidemic, Thérèse was able to pursue creative work, including painting and poetry. Her superiors asked her to paint murals for the chapel walls, which she loved. Thérèse had been an avid reader as a girl and may have learned to write poetry by reading the work of the Carmelite St. John of the Cross. This was very different from the manual labor of cooking, gardening, and laundry to which Thérèse had been previously assigned, but Day is clear that these efforts were, quote, truly a task. It was to be done in her spare time, so doubtless she was forced to concentrate on the task, much as a newspaper reporter has to work over an assignment and commit her painfully composed verses to memory until she had some time in the evening to put the words down on paper. Day, in her earlier comments on the artisan work of Thérèse's parents, a watchmaker and a lace maker, notes that fine craftsmanship can require physical and intellectual strain to the same degree as heavy work in fields and factories. Intellectual and creative labor is also work which draws on our human faculties and which contributes to our enjoyment and understanding of the world. The Catholic worker draws from the Benedictine motto of ora et labora, prayer and work, as the foundation for the good life. Here and elsewhere, Day honors the various human efforts offered in service of the common good as means of participation in God's creative work. All labor which contributes to human flourishing has dignity. In Thérèse's work as poet and writer, Day sees some kinship with her own work as a journalist, a vocation through which she uplifted the struggles of the worker and the poor for justice and pricked the conscience of the powerful. The day-to-day practice of the Catholic worker movement is based on the works of mercy, most obviously the corporal works of feeding the hungry and sheltering the unhoused, which are offered to the poor. However, following Peter Maurin, Day always emphasized the primacy of the spiritual. In her September 1974 column, she wrote, "A deep and abiding joy can only be ours if we emphasize the primacy of the spiritual. We must grow in faith, in our spiritual capacity to do all things in Him who strengthens us, even change the social order so that wars will cease, and it will be easier to be good, to keep our sanity, be whole men, holy men, and truly love one another." The spiritual works of mercy, then, are even more important than the corporal, instructing the ignorant, counseling the doubtful, admonishing the sinner, and above all, praying for the living and the dead. It is through these actions that Day believed we would change the social order and make a world in which it was easier to be good. At Carmel, Thérèse and her sisters were engaged in the spiritual works of mercy daily. The missionary charism was not only served by sending sisters out to start new Carmels, but by praying for missions abroad and by praying for the needs of the world. Chanting the daily office, the liturgical prayer of the Church, is a spiritual and intellectual as well as physical form of work, as are the various penances and mortifications that the sisters undertook on behalf of those who had been entrusted to them in prayer. Prayer and penance, Day writes, these are indeed spiritual works, spiritual weapons to save souls, penance for luxury when the destitute suffer, a work to increase the sum total of love and peace in the world. 6 or 7 hours of prayer, a life of hard work and silence the rest of the time, 2 brief periods of recreation when there was permission to talk, sew, paint, or take up the busy work all women delight in. By the time she was 20, Thérèse had lost both her parents. She truly depended on God alone as her father, but her community depended on her to a degree that her sisters in Carmel would not have anticipated when she entered. Day writes, when she had entered, tall, slender, composed, she had surprised them all with this dignity. They had expected a child of 15, but her height, her composure, her great self-control astonished them. Her own recognition of her youth and inexperience had made her keep much to the background, cling to silence, hide from notice those first years. But when all the sisters were laid low and had to be nursed by the 2 who had not been stricken, Thérèse had perforce to assume an authority, an initiative which showed her worth. The Carmelite vocation is difficult and austere, and yet in the midst of this hidden, penitential way of life, Thérèse was cheerful, performing the heaviest tasks herself so she could spare another sister the work. Day writes for readers who are paralyzed with the feeling of their own insignificance in a world of rapid change and technological progress, to tell us that there is dignity and purpose in laboring for and loving those closest to us. Thérèse found constant ways to add her efforts to the work of God and to add more love, more charity into her immediate sphere of interactions, trusting that God would send those efforts rippling beyond the walls of Carmel.